What is up, Theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Hombrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you episodes, interviews with some of the best scholars, thinkers, theologians, philosophers, scientists. Oh yeah, I mean, this is where you come if you want to nerd out with your geek out. And today on the podcast is my dear friend, like since high school, and theological ethicist at Campbell University in North Carolina, Ryan Andrew Newson. He has a brand new book that just came out titled Cut in Stone, Confederate Monuments and Theological Disruption. And he wrote this book, researched this book, way before it became extremely, extremely timely. So I was so excited to get to talk to him because, well, he's a friend, and because his book's out. And I like to let people know about my friend's cool books. And then on top of it, it's a timely, important conversation as more and more people are waking up to the legacy of racism and white supremacy in America, and are seeking to address it. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Check out that book, Cut in Stone. Before we jump in, I want to give a big shout out to Scott Jones. That's right. I think Scott was first on Hombrewed Christianity in 2008. He was like episode number 4 or something. He is a UCC minister. He did his PhD at the University of Oklahoma on Alfred North Whitehead. And he wrote the first review on Amazon for my new book, Divine Self-Investment. He said, Trip Fuller has written a fine book. He's pulled together so many different theological threads and made sense of them. The first chapter concisely and straightforwardly summarizes some of the key themes of process thought. The second chapter is the best summary of the current state of historical Jesus research I've read. Subsequent chapters review major developments in Christology and places differing voices in conversation with one another, developing from them the major themes that a contemporary theology should have. And the conclusion draws it all together to present a fresh and inspiring picture of Christ. I know I'll find it helpful for teaching and preaching for years. Thank you, Trip Fuller, and thank you, Scott Jones. That's right. And you too can leave a review on Amazon or wherever, Goodreads and such, when you go get my brand new book, Divine Self-Investment. It is out, it is available, and I'm super pumped for you all to get to read it. Now, if you want to hear it, me read it to you, then you need to be a member of the Hombrewed Community. That's right. Over the next few months, I'm putting chapter by chapter of me reading my brand new book in the Hombrewed Christianity members only podcast feed. It is a secret podcast that I'm telling you about, but it's for all the members of the Hombrewed Community. They donate, support the podcast each month, are part of a private Facebook group. They get a secret podcast feed access, depending on what level you're at, of different lectures, classes, like the Brueggemann Introduction to the Old Testament class, Alfred North Whitehead with John Cobb class, the Bonhoeffer class, Black Theology class we're currently doing with Adam Clark, and all kinds of stuff before that if you're new, you haven't even heard about yet. So there is tons of material available for all of the members. If you want to join up, go to hombrewedcommunity.com. You can support the podcast. You can get the goods. Join the Facebook group, and you will get to hear me read the book. And what I've been doing is I record the chapter, and then I record a less than 5-minute summary of the big ideas and themes from it. So it's like Cliff Notes. But I was going to do an audiobook, and then lockdown happened. And surprisingly, children not cooperative with reading at quiet levels. Yeah, exactly. So, here we go. It's time for Ryan Newson to talk about his book, Cut in Stone. And I've given you a robust lure to join the Hombrewed Community, like some really cool new people, say Mark, JD, Carl, Marjorie, all new members of the Hombrewed Community. They went to hombrewedcommunity.com. But after you listen to this podcast episode, you're going to want to go check out Cut in Stone. It's a great book. And I don't always say that about my friends' books. You can just listen to those interests. See, like, did I jump around? Did I dodge? Saying what I actually thought. Don't have to play games. Ryan's awesome. Here it is. Enjoy.
today on the podcast is a special kind of scholar, someone that chose to be my friend before I was so cool and had a theology podcast. Ryan Andrew Newson. So what's up, Ryan?
Nothing, man. How's it going? It's good to see you, man.
Well, this might be the shortest podcast of the month because we just talked for 30 minutes about things that are not on the podcast. But if you're lucky, they might come back around. Ryan has a brand new book out called Cut in Stone, Confederate Monuments and Theological Disruption. And Cut in Stone is not a reference to his svelte body, but...
Dead bod theology, baby.
but Cut in Stone, monuments, Confederate monuments. So maybe the place to begin is everyone's just using their iPhone to go look up this book so they can purchase it.
Right.
So maybe you can give some background to yourself. Other than you went to the third or fourth best high school in Raleigh, North Carolina, you did not go to Enloe. You went to Broughton, regrettably. So how did you recover as a Broughton graduate and end up a theological ethicist?
Oh God, man. It's great to see you, man. Seriously, in the face to face, and not through Facebook. I went to Broughton. I'm from Raleigh, and I started getting into theological ethics pretty quickly after I became a Christian in high school. So I didn't grow up going to church and all that kind of stuff, but I became a Christian relatively for a youth. It felt really late. Looking back, it wasn't late at all, but I was going to used bookstores and reading like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and stuff. And
like all the cool kids.
Reader's Corner. And
Reader's Corner. You had Stephen's Bookshop. That was a pretty epic one.
One's still there. The other's been taken the way of gentrification, but reading like Buber and stuff. And so my original, my coming to faith, coming to be a Christian, and my sensibility about like moral, ethical questions and how they touch ground concretely are always one and the same. Like I've never really had a sense of what it means to have faith that wasn't already tied up in the sort of like wrestling with what it means to live in the world as a sort of person with the sort of kind of deep existential questions, and then later on kind of political, ethical questions that came along with it. So like
because you came to faith in high school, it came to faith with the desire to deconstruct. Well, other than you came to faith with August and everything after.
That's actually not wrong.
It was at the period of time where the world you were handed in its interpretation is you're going through that kind of deconstructive process, owning your own voice and experience. So like you were introduced to Jesus as fellow deconstructor, not like if you're born into faith.
Yes. In fact,
then you're turning against religion to figure out your own voice.
Yes. Some of the things, and I was going to this youth group that was like, they had some cool kids from Enloe included that were quite smart or whatever, but there was some basic stuff that was assumed by and large by a lot of the students and other kids that I didn't have, right? Like I didn't have some of that stuff that I had to do. I had other things. In a weird way, coming to like care about Jesus and the Gospels was its own sort of deconstruction of certain assumptions I had already, right? So yeah, absolutely. It was already, and so Jesus became the sort of like, I was like already in the middle of Raccor's like desert or whatever. And you go through phases of that. I went through various other, it's not as if high school was the last time I went through a deconstructive period. I'm going through one right now, frankly. But that was what it was. So me being a theological ethicist, looking back, was already kind of baked into whatever kind of faith I was going to have as a kid. Yeah.
Well, but I actually think that, that's really fascinating because, for some people, their faith is the element, it's kind of their nest, right? Like it's the place they can rest in and sit in. And for others, faith is the demand or it's the other. It's the kind of auto deconstructive element of existence where like if you're going to learn to live before you die, what you already have isn't good enough. So some part of it's bullshit. So we got to figure out which part. Right. And I really feel like which side of religion you are really changes your disposition to a tradition and what religion's doing, what a congregation's doing, what practices are doing. It is in many ways it's connected to that kind of like priestly or prophetic divide in ministry. But the way you see a faith, what it's doing changes. And when it goes to thinking through our identity now as Americans and as Christians in America, how you relate to your past and stuff that you're wrestling with in the book, like which lens are you bringing to it?
When I come to
changes
this
the way you see things.
I mean, so I guess, thinking through the sort of trying to sort of describe the theological assumptions and values and implications of really more generally in the United States and then the American South more particularly, and then sort of concretized in these monuments is a sort of a manifestation of the sort of process that is more wide from like I just haven't known a faith or a way of talking about faith that is and it sounds weird but like comforting. Like it's not a sort of comforting thing. In fact, sometimes I get sort of annoyed with it and I wish I didn't believe it, but I do find myself believing it. It's like truly a confession in the sense of like almost an admission, like, yeah, it's true. I do believe like, the Logos became Sarx in Christ. And so then the question for me becomes, as I look around a world that seems at odds with these narratives that I'm claimed by, how do I square that set of narratives about Christ and in Galilee with, and the sort of liberation like work that he embodies with the sort of also called Christian narratives that I see around me in my society, and certainly as like a white dude, like that are meant to sort of be of me and for me, but I don't like, right? How do I square those two things? And so in some senses, the book is like a kind of one particular manifestation of or an investigation of a wider kind of desire to do that kind of untangling work. Quite particular, but opens on to, I hope, wider problems and questions.
So when like growing up in Raleigh, we have or had a very significant Confederate monument in downtown. It was probably bigger than all the other war monuments to all the other wars that the actual United States was in.
Right.
But this was to the losers. And so but so like that monument, right, was always part of the background. If you grew up in Raleigh, it was there. You passed it at field trips and all that kind of stuff. Maybe you can share a bit of your own biography, especially as someone who wasn't like born into, I mean, your family's not all Southern in the sense of mine was Southern and Baptist and Southern Baptist. So it was very different. Like, what was that your experience growing up in relationship to the story of the South and the story of faith when you weren't, even though you grew up in the space, you weren't an insider the whole time? And how did that change over time as you started to cultivate your own critical lens?
Right. So that's well said. I mean, you know me. So my not all of my family is from the South. We don't have even the family that is from the South is like poor people from the South. There's not like a long lineage of we fought in this, that, and the other war, and we did this, that, and the other thing. You know what I'm saying? So and my particular parents were didn't like any of that stuff. I mean, they were explicitly raised as such to not value any of that. So it still seeps in. I mean, I did go to Broughton, and Broughton, distinct from Inlow, has a lot more of that sort of stuff around. But it was very much sort of, I think that's a great way to put it, a sort of insider-outsider dynamic. I've talked to another colleague, Karen Guth, who teaches at Holy Cross now, but she was raised up in Furman, and she had a similar kind of dynamic. She's also written on Confederate monuments. And so, at first they're just there. And I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind as like not necessarily a bad, I mean, I hope that's not special pleading, but it's not inherently a bad thing. They were sort of just there. It was just the wallpaper. It was just the landmark that you'd use to give directions. It was just like, where do you park when you go to First Baptist, Raleigh, or whatever?
It was also a really, really good Pokestop.
Yeah,
on Pokemon
stuff
Go.
Like that.
As someone that had a kid very invested in Pokemon Go and a daughter who was at the preschool, every day we got to slow down when we passed it because there's a high quality Pokestop.
Yeah. And I've talked to friends. That's a kind of common experience of people from a variety of backgrounds. Actually, they were sort of brought in, a lot of people who do work on like material objects talk about this. Like when people rise up to push against a monument, it sometimes can evoke the sort of defense that wasn't even there in the first place. And so it wasn't necessarily the case that it was just something that everyone walked past and was like, oh my God, look at that monument. But that slowly happened. And so for me, the thing that was always annoying and offensive was the flag, right? I mean, that was sort of the argument in the 90s, late 90s, early aughts, and rightly so, obviously. The monuments were a separate sort of conversation. They came more to my mind. I'm trying to think precisely when, but the most like direct moment was after and during in the aftermath of the Dylan Roof murdering in Charleston. When these things that were previously not as visible became more visible. I mean, that's the best way to put it. And there was a sort of question put, I think, to the entire country of, okay, what are you going to do with this sort of these narratives sort of coming to bear in a new sort of way? Like, what are you going to do about it? And there was just a sort of urgency put on questions that previously might have proceeded in a sort of kind of academic or theoretical way. It became very much like, no, like something's going to be said to that. Also, to that point, and I know you can probably relate to this as well, is I'm having a child that was young, and we just moved back from Los Angeles, and those events happened, and it was just like, okay, now my kids are going to be raised in this context, and I know a bit about that context, and what is going to break this cycle that's going on like that? And so the monuments became this sort of locus, both culturally and kind of existentially, for like how to organize my thoughts around it, particularly as a white guy who recognized, I think, after not having been raised in it, but recognized that these were things that were sort of meant to be trophies of and for like my people or whatever. I'm using scare quotes there. Yeah, that's when they kind of really came to fruition in my mind after Mother Manual.
Yeah, and it's a, I mean, even thinking of that event, right? Like Governor Haley the other day during the Republican convention, who had some initiative in removing the Confederate flag, calls them during Trump's convention symbols of contentious symbols, right? Like she didn't even say Confederate flag, right? Or like wants to even acknowledge what it is, because that would be breaking rank with the white supremacist party. But they're symbols that she has to even work around it as the one who recognized this doesn't work anymore, right? Like shows that there's like way more invested in them underneath the surface than a lot of us that saw that as like passive background knew.
Right.
And I remember when I first moved back, and you were working on this book. I remember you like telling me when the Raleigh one was built and what the whole context for it, and going, I had no idea. It was just there when I was hanging out with my grandpa, and he used it as a chance to talk about our family, you know?
Right.
And it's maybe you could share a bit about that and how, a majority of the monuments themselves that are up around the country, their origin isn't even in the immediate post-war. But much later and for much more devious reasons.
Well, devious, it feels that way now. Historically, at the time,
Yeah,
it was
I guess.
just like they were like, "This is for white supremacy." I mean, you can read the dedication ceremonies. To their credit, maybe, I don't know how to say that, they weren't hiding it, right? I do want to say about that Nikki anecdote. That's part of what made me suspicious in the first place. That's what part of what hooked me into it was this sense that someone like, someone could say, "Okay, fine, let's get rid of the battle flag on the state cap of South Carolina. Let's take down the monument," but not for the reason of wanting to address the sort of underlying narratives that like were present and embodied by them, but rather almost as a way of hiding the evidence, or like maybe in the worst case to just be more palatable to sort of corporate forces that can come in and further gentrify cities or whatever. But like it worried me that there were some folks who got onto that as a sort of it was like a sort of an appeasement, but there was no sense of trying to touch at the wider sort of streams that I felt like those were like the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Like I heard people like that say that, and I was like, this feels fishy to me. And that's what I ultimately like think is fishy, is that it doesn't want to tap into the deeper, it wants to be really coded, really careful, not tap into these deeper ideological narratives. Those narratives, of course, include history. And so, as you say, like, one of the like big lies about the monuments, at this point, it's more widely known. It wasn't at the time when I first started working on it. Nowadays, at least the people who were ever going to know it probably know it. You know what I'm saying? Some people just are going to do the sort of people in the gospel, just close their ears and scream. But they were not constructed right after the Civil War. I mean, that's the bottom line. Both Brundage and Gaines Foster have shown incontrovertibly that these were, I mean, a few were, but so right after the Civil War and in the sort of decades right then, there were monuments that were put up. Those tended to be in cemeteries. Those tended to be much more funereal in design. They tended to be more sense of like, this is for the Confederate dead and little else, right? Which those might have problems, but those are performing in a much different kind of way. The majority absolutely peak between the years of 1890 and 1920, which correspond with, I was just reading, who was I just reading talk about this? The peak of white supremacy, you could say, would be like the 1920s in the United States. Even though in our cultural imagination, sometimes that corresponds with the Roaring '20s or whatever, but not so for black folks in the country. So the majority of them are erected in this period, which is the sort of aftermath of the Reconstruction period, and then sort of a massive Southern resistance to what was seen as sort of overreach that had happened in the South, of Northern aggression on the South, as far as laws and codes and politicians and whatever policies that people in the South, white folks in the South, didn't want. And so there's a sort of backlash to this, both kind of culturally or in narratives that were told, and then as well at the same time in extra legal violence, as well as monuments to these Confederacies. So the sort of one of the things that just has to be kept in mind always, especially if people say, well, isn't this or that sort of ancient history? Like, these monuments don't reflect necessarily the time period in which they say they're about. A Confederate monument that's built today represents and embodies values of today way more, if not completely, than it does from right after the Civil War. And so the question then becomes, what narratives, right? What ideologies that are going on at that time, not right after the Civil War. And so that sort of is a sort of aspect change. If anybody in good faith is going to be able to talk about that, that is one of the things that can help. I've found in my conversations with people who are resistant. It's like,
yeah. Well, in that, I remember some of you may have heard some of this before when Ryan's been on the podcast, or I never remember what has been said or not said, but for a while we were in the same Sunday school class. So, which is probably Andrea should just be, glad that we like I don't the idea of having to preach to that many PhDs in the room is just impressive. Like there's very little affirmation a PhD person can give a sermon, because you can't turn off your critical brain other than I choose to keep coming. Right? Like that should just come with all the affirmation you get, right? So we were in the same Sunday school class, and I just remember you sending me the link from the News and Observer from back in the day, and you're like reading the report on it. And I'm like, oh shit. That's just like, whatever your natural, and this is Tripp as just the white Southerner full of family, packed full of Confederacy admiration, society members. Like when you read it, you're just like, whoa, that's not good. This is not good. This is not good. Right. And that was not too long apart from when Elgin lost his emotions about the monument. Yeah. And because he saw a school class walking in front of it with cannons pointing at African American students saying, "For our Confederate dead." And he's like, "Who's the our?" And I just remember, no, it is. And I have walked in front of it with plenty of fellow classmates on multiple field trips and never asked that question as a student growing up, you know?
Yeah.
And a lot of Baptists walked past it, walking right into First Baptist for years. Yeah. And I walked past it with my grandfather every time I went to visit him downtown. Right. And so there's this thing that comes up with a monument where it's sitting there. It's just an object, but it also in it is this kind of like passive inertia of an interpretation of history.
Yes.
And so it sits there as a hermeneutical key for how you relate to your past. And so the battle over them is a battle for how we're going to read our identity. And the thing that struck me reading your book, and reading your friend's book when you were hanging out with them while they were working on it, it's its own thing. It reminded me of something you said one night we were hanging out, tasting high quality craft beverages from Colorado. Is that you said something like, I was telling you the story about Elgin, and you said, yeah, well, when you recognize something about your past has been lifted up, you don't want to valorize, that doesn't mean you don't stop telling your story. It just means different things are on the front page. And I think a lot of the monument questions, right, are experienced for people of privilege and whose identity or history is connected to white supremacy as attacks on their essence, as attacks on their identity.
Yeah.
When really the contestation isn't whether you're a part of America or whether you're here. It's what part of our history will we valorize and say to our grandkids, this is our best day. And our best day isn't one where that statue's there. That doesn't mean we all don't have people in our family that have moments in their lives and history that are worth valorizing, right?
Yeah.
And
yes,
so I feel like that hermeneutical process is something that, because you chose these kind of objects that are cut in stone, you have to wrestle with it in a different way. So how, like, let me in on that. Like, what is it like to think about the hermeneutical event in relationship to past, and then the decisions to monumentize elements of it?
Well, that's a huge, I mean, thank you for that. That's a huge part of it. So part of what has to happen, and part of what does happen as I read into these, and if I interpreted them under a theological aspect. I mean, that's a part of the thing to note.
Yeah.
It's not a book on it's not a historical book. It's a theological book, but it involves other people's historical work, right? That becomes the question. So how does one understand what's happening when one looks at the past? And so some people, because they have privileged, I mean, it's very much, there is a good analogy between hermeneutical approaches to sacred text, where it's like, because somebody privileges a particular way of reading, and they don't they've never recognized that they are in fact approaching it hermeneutically. Obviously, Anglo-European folks who assume that their approach is just the universalized way of approaching something, so they don't call it a contextual thing. It's just the thing. The question becomes, how do you, what does it look like to recognize that when you're looking at the past and narrating it, you're in fact sort of doing interpretation as you look at that? Mm-hmm. And so thinking about that, like the question becomes, what is the key? How are these monuments not sort of serving as a hermeneutical key, but like representing a hermeneutical key that far outstrips the monuments themselves? I mean, if every monument went down tomorrow, which would be great, like that hermeneutical key that they kind of stand in for will still be doing work, I think, unfortunately, in our country. And so that's the sort of move. And so one of the things that's just noteworthy and obvious is like that who's the our question is, you recognize, or you start to like see just how limited both the sort of narration of the past is by that's very much a project of propaganda that was meant to do a lot of things, not chief break up sort of popular political movements that were fusing across racial lines in North Carolina. But also sort of it blocks out the sort of work that like the 1619 Project and stuff are trying to recover, which would be recognizing the ways in which, in fact, the promises, whatever they may be, however imperfectly they may have been lived into, of the United States, were not really being represented by these people who were behind these statues, both like the UDC and the government and other sorts of people donating, but rather, as like Eddie Glaude and other people talk about, like it becomes a sort of, and certainly King more than anybody, democracy in this country looks more like Black people and other people who've been oppressed making good or trying to force the country to make good on the promises that are laid out for them, but have never actually been. There's been like a promissory note that has not been cashed, right? That becomes the sort of question. So what it like opens you onto is both that sort of historical narration, and then again, sort of theological habits of thinking that are embedded with, like when I started going to youth group in Raleigh or whatever, it wouldn't have been called like white theology, white hermeneutical strategies, but that's what they were. It was, and I was the kid who was already it hadn't happened yet. My senior year, we went to, the United States went to war with Iraq. I was like the kid that was like, why are we doing this? This seems wrong. Like I wrote an op-ed in my high school paper about that, right? And the strategies of filtering out the sort of political, social implications of what I saw to be in Christianity were just completely, we had been trained in ways of reading scripture that excised those out of our imagination. So all of Christianity became obviously a matter of individuals going to heaven, making sure you don't masturbate too much if you're a guy, and that's about it. And making sure you burn your Red Hot Chili Peppers CDs or whatever. Like it was just a complete farce as far as like tapping into the sorts of anything that seems like Jesus, Messiah, talks and cares about in his time on earth. So that's what it opens onto. It's like it becomes this iceberg where it's like there's this way of narrating the past, but you realize that's the other thing. I realized that a lot of the same talking points are very much still present today. They're still being manifest in the same sorts of ways. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and you can hear the rhyming of it in various sorts of theologies today. So, sorry, that was a little long.
No. Well, I mean, I talk plenty. Don't worry. So for people that haven't checked out the book, Cut in Stone, the movement in the book is pretty fascinating because it begins with looking at history and then looks at the past and then the future and then the present. And you talk about memories constructed, and then whiteness concretized and wounds obscured. Yeah. And that movement from past, future to present is well, if you go through the history of theology and thought is structured that way, it is like Hegel, Moltmann, Pannenberg, things like that, where before you talk about the present before you and what is the present that we're analyzing, wounds obscured, the past already has to be judged by the future, and then you're able to see the present for what it is. And I think the normal way of looking at this story, if you're putting it, especially in an imagination that is structured by the domination systems telling of history for market planning and things like that, the trajectory of colonialism is you go past, present, future. And one of the things that struck me is it to look at the future prior to the wounds obscured. In a sense, it's precisely by attending to God's judgment of the past, the memories that have been constructed and then brought right into this moment. It's precisely by judging them that it opens up space for the wounds obscured to become to the fore. Yeah. And it's like if you rewrote that book right now, you would be a lot more clear and aggressive in ways you couldn't have, right? Because you edited it before George Floyd's murder by the state and all the protests and everything that came after. So I wonder, like, as someone who looked at the monuments and the history and the things they played in this kind of eschatologically prophetic rendering, like, what of the wounds obscured do you think we aren't recognizing or wrestling with now? Like, in what ways is our current present obscuring wounds by hyper-focalizing or essentializing monuments as opposed to other things?
Well, I could almost read it to you. I basically, the short answer is there's two ways to think about. Thank you for that. That was what I was attempting to do subtly. The first would be, I just think that there's theological habits that just are uncomfortable with wounds, generally speaking. So, like, the first thing to say is, like, even beyond the sort of particular wounds of the present and how they're kind of returning. I get a lot of this from, I mean, she's drawing on her own work, but like Shelley Rambo and Resurrecting Wounds, she talks about this. So, like, there are sort of habits of theological imagination of thinking that are really uncomfortable with woundedness itself, and want to narrate it in a sort of straightforward linear progression of, if you do talk about them, I was, or we were marked by various sorts of wounds. Now they're healed, and now we move forward into this like perfect future, rather than seeing it as a sort of like kind of wounds continually returning, particularly if you don't attend to them. But even if you do, like, they sort of have a habit of returning and returning and returning. And so she highlights John Calvin's exegesis of the wounds of the resurrected Jesus in John as a sort of example of how Calvin understands those wounds, as he tries his best to get past those wounds as quickly as possible, and sort of subtly suggests they might not even actually be there, but they were just appeared to be there for sort of pedagogical purposes for the disciples. So that's the first thing, is that, like, I think that just even forming a kind of imagination whereby Christians are more comfortable with facing wounds or confessing, especially if they're of or perceived to be of your own, that's important to do. Particular wounds in the present is related to these monuments would be a great example of, the shorthand would be any manifestation, contemporary manifestation of whiteness and white supremacy as it continues to go on in our world, manifestations of the new Jim Crow. So, yeah, precisely, police practices, prison practices, how I list. I have a little line here where I go, the unfortunate revival of race science and which parallels 19th century phrenology, which is also concurrent with Confederate monuments, by the way, which places that now in DNA and stuff. But it's, you don't measure skulls, but it's pretty similar logics, stand your ground laws, etc. And so it's kind of relatively easy to condemn or to say, let's take down the monuments. It's a little bit, it gets more close to home because that's talking about something back then, whatever. It's a little close to home when you start talking about stand your ground laws or, policing practices in the United States, et cetera.
Well, and I think, in one sense, there are so many unacknowledged monuments of white supremacy, of Jim Crow, and all in that entire legacy. And public schools might be the most deadly, right?
Yeah.
Like the United States is a nation where your public schools budget is based on housing property tax. And not only that, if you live in really liberal states like California, they give you the ability to pay property tax at whatever value it had when it was worth $900,000 less than it is now. Because if you own property in the United States, you're worth more than someone who has to rent.
Life, liberty, and property.
Yeah, I know. Okay, you make that joke, but we should pause for a second. Like, John Locke said life, liberty, and property were like the three inalienable rights. And because America loved God so much, we changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we all know is the American dream, which is namely a lifestyle that is supported by three families who have a large amount of their labor alienated. But you don't have to see them because you live behind a fence.
It's pursuit.
And drive past them on the way to work.
Not happiness, I dare say, the pursuit. The same people who would say a republic if you can keep it, It's like, okay, thanks. One more talking point. I've got my talking point bingo card out. So
you did? You did. What's funny is y'all don't know this right now, but Ryan is also in his Revolutionary War reenactment garb because he likes to do that on weekends.
Yeah, but it is the Revolutionary War from Starship Troopers, so keep that in mind.
Keep that in mind.
And I'm the brain bug.
Wow. Starship Trooper references. But I do, in one sense, the Confederate monuments leaving in the places they are is important because the dis-ease that comes up from it is revelatory. But what kind of advice do you have? Because I know plenty of people who, if you had asked them prior to the monuments leaving and prior to the moment we've been in the last few months about the monuments, they would have said, whatever. I mean, like, that's not how we see things now, blah, 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 blah. Wouldn't have known any of the history or anything. And they would have just said, like, why are you going to cause trouble while I'm trying to mess with it? And then as things like shift and then the focus comes on it, they're like, yeah, I mean, that's not a big deal. Like, why can't we get rid of it? Right. So in this moment where so many people, right, are catching up with just what is getting itself done in the monuments, are there other unacknowledged monuments or other unacknowledged symbols that you would, as a Christian ethicist, point our attention to, where maybe that same suspicion, right, where your son, like I had, points out something very obvious to a monument, and then you're like, oh, junk. I hadn't thought about that. That you think we should cultivate suspicion to, because the prophetic vision of the kingdom of God is on the advance, and we don't want to be on the wrong side.
As far as other like symbols or monuments, is that what you're like particularly asking about, or just any in more in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of different. Like one example is American exceptionalism, right? Like American exceptionalism is a linguistic monument to an ideology that was birthed post World War II, where the birth of the neoliberal order comes into being, namely with our passive acknowledgement that we nuked people and no one else has, and we haven't. So would you like to organize an economic arrangement where you all, people in the World War, acknowledge our supremacy, but it's okay because we're going to export all the passive violence on other nations that have yet to be brought into the World Trade Organization, which is a wonderfully fascinating, uplifting body of economic development. Like, I mean, that might be a little hyperbolic, but maybe not. But you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
So like we say American exceptionalism, and I see all these people are like, we got to vote for Joe Biden because we just need common sense back in the White House and a competent person. And I'm like, I mean, I would like to not have a neo-fascist, like, could be voted Grand Dragon in the White House who can't even use complete sentences and is probably snorting Adderall. Like, yeah, I think Joe Biden's like a huge plus compared to that. But if you think like Joe Biden, like how did he end his freaking acceptance speech? His last line was like, "And God bless the troops." Really? I don't. Why? We're not even like that was your last line? Like, he didn't say, "God bless all the people who have dumb shit family members without masks on, exposing them to coronavirus," or "God bless all the people who are essential workers who have kids and can't provide adequate instruction because they have to go to work to help all the people in the top 20% who aren't using masks and keeping it." Like, he didn't say anything of that. He was like, "God bless the troops. You know, this is my parting shot. You're going to have to take it because I'm not Donald Trump." But anyway,
well, that's the slogan, I think.
Actually, I tried to convince a friend to start a super PAC called "I'm enthusiastically holding my nose for Joe Biden."
I mean, I am. I mean, yeah.
No, I don't want to minimize the desire to not have Donald Trump.
Oh, I don't think anybody who knows you would confuse, what you're saying there. But I hear you. I mean, that's part of, maybe that's one of the things, you know what it reminds me of, you talking there? It reminds me of like both James Baldwin and Malcolm X. Baldwin more, but I know Malcolm X does too, talk about this, where, King was Southern, and people would talk about these sort of movements that would happen in the 60s, 50s, 60s as like, sometimes talk about them as uniquely Southern problems, and in a sense they are. But like Baldwin was so explicit about like, these are questions and problems and issues that undergird, it's a much wider problem than simply like just the South or something like that. And so there is a sort of temptation to look at something like a Confederate monument, which is obviously offensive, like, at least to a lot of us. Like, you just see it and it's like, it's evident what it's up to. And to therefore sort of make it, there's a sort of parallel to what you're just talking about, where it's like, you can say like, okay, if we get rid of this thing, if we get rid of this offending symbol, then we have sort of addressed the sort of wider issue. And it's not to say you shouldn't do that, right? But it is to say that you have to attend to and be understand that these things sort of rise up out of a soil. And if you're not going to attend to that soil, then they're just going to keep coming, maybe by another name, but you're going to get confirmed by another name. So I think that's sort of like, and as a theologian, my thought goes to the sort of theological because these monuments embody particular Christian theological kind of perverted beliefs about what is ultimately good and powerful and closest to God, i.e. whiteness, or the nature of sacrifice. So that might be a good one to name. One of the things that are pretty much universally held up by Confederate monuments is the sort of sacrifices of our Confederate dead. Sort of remembrance and sacrifice goes together. And in fact, around the turn of when a lot of these monuments were emerging was what one Kelly Denton Borhaug talks about, sort of the cult of sacrifice was emerging in the United States that equated the sort of death of soldiers to the American soldiers, United States soldiers, et cetera, to sacrifices that sort of like, cemented something that was good and sacred or whatever. And so that is very much something that is still around in our culture in the United States. The sort of overlay of something that is hard and morally fraught in a lot of ways, with a sort of language of sacralization that therefore makes it hard to even criticize it or name it as such, because you put on it a kind of language that makes it then in the category of untouchability. It's quite possible to be critical of Confederate monuments ostensibly, but to tap into that exact same narrative that they like underwrite. And so that'd be one like very good kind of example that in a way maybe you're getting at with the Biden, the Joe Biden quote there. So, there's sort of the way to think about that then for me as a person, like what to do would be like, there's sort of short and medium term things to be done, in the short term. Of course, I think there are like things that do need to be addressed exactly about these Confederate monuments, but it needs to also open on to more ongoing work, particularly in my own setting, like among theologians and folks and white theologians who have continued to move in the same sorts of habits of thinking and hermeneutical practices that if left alone, it's just going to continue to sort of reinforce the same sorts of habits that gave rise in the first place. So that'd be a good one.
So, underneath that, I feel like one of the biggest challenges is honesty about reality. And that the number of people in lockdown who, and these are like friends, right? And a lot of them even like members of Hombrewed Christianity and stuff. And so who thought that early on in the last election and then thereafter, I was exaggerating the possibilities for Donald Trump.
They better be ready again, by the way.
Or that my sheer shock of the like growth in ugly, like, externalized white supremacy in the South upon moving back was hyperbolic. Or now like, all right, Tripp, maybe you weren't being crazy, right?
Did they think you were just lying, or did they think you were just...
And it was usually Southerners, people that live there. Like I came back and then like friends of mine or people I would encounter, they were like, so what's it like moving back? I'm like, y'all are racist. You know what I mean? Like, will you come back like, this is bad. And the whole time I'm sitting there going like, is this what I was like? I really hope not. And I hope I don't grow back into this. This is not what I want.
Right.
And that whole thing. Anyway, like, I don't say anything about people.
Right. Well, there is that sense of let's not do. But like, there is a sort of like, you can only act within the world you see. There's a lot of truth to that.
I agree with that,
right?
and that's why I think the George Floyd video.
Yes.
And so Adam Clark and I are doing this Black Theology class right now, and it started with him calling me and saying, "Why are all my white friends acting like police doing violence to black people is real now?" Right. And
Dave Chappelle made that joke like 10 years ago.
Yeah. And so,
it's like, oh, the white people saw it on Newsweek. Now they know it's true. It's like, but there is something like, who knows what it will be, but if you don't see what you don't see, something changes that aspect for folks. And that's good,
and so,
I guess.
Yeah. And so like, there's this connection point, and it may be what I was reading at the same time I was reading your book, but John Sobrino has this line where he says that to have a genuine liberation theology is simply to be honest about reality, to not lie.
Amen.
Where reality is a scandal, there is concealment, and the crucified people are the truth tellers of reality. And
dang, that's good.
And I know I really wish John Sobrino was Pope, but Papa Francis isn't that far off. But like I really feel like that the crucified people are the truth tellers of reality. And sometimes your unconscious investment in the systemic structures of perverse power is so close. Reality has to shake you from your worship of an idol.
Yeah.
And,
yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah.
you know, reality that becomes revelation for the privileged is a revelation of an idol. And idols, be it of culture or privilege, they demand victims in order to thrive. And part of our contemporary context, be it white supremacy, the nature of the police state as it emerged from, at the end of slavery and such,
Slave patrols,
to market ingenuity. The crucified people, the lynched people, are concealed, and that's required for the preservation of the power. And so, to me, there's this sense that you wrote this book about monuments before they started coming down, right?
Yes.
And now that they're coming down, it's like that ball got hit off the tee, which is like the beginner step for recognizing things. So if you had to put a new ball up there and you're just like, well, this is like what the first swing is, if you're going to be honest about reality, if you were going to perform in our moment the same function you were doing for the moment in which you wrote the book, not in which it got published.
Right.
Like what is that bit of reality you want to seize and go, I'm a theologian, an ethicist, a Christian in a place of privilege, and I want to be honest about this reality. And if I do so, I'm going to structure it in a prophetic way of relating to the reality, where like you do this, the past, the future, the present, and then I'm going to think back to it. Like, is there a different locus that you would want to run that same type of analysis on?
Yeah. I don't have like a sort of thing I'm doing right this second. So I don't want to speak to what other folks are doing. I do think those things exist. So, I don't want to just say something just because I think there's a lot of places in which it goes. The main thing that always kind of or comes to mind when I think about this kind of thing is the way. So I was talking about Raleigh, but I think it there's so many. So I'm not trying to say this is more important than the others or whatever. They're interrelated. But the ways in which the sort of ongoing practices, ways of structuring economy, make it almost impossible to live in cities and urban centers in the United States, probably around the world, but I'm not so sure about that. That obviously dovetails with a whole set of sort of economic practices that are built on the backs of like Sabrina would call it the crucified, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not really a thing so much as like the way, I guess it'd be like the supply chain or something, like the way the supply chain is set up in such a way to produce cheap stuff to buy at the end of it. But all the sort of, this isn't new, obviously, but like all the ways, the blood that's led up to that, the sort of injustice that has led up to that is, it's enabled precisely because it's hidden, right? If it was hidden, if it was exposed, if people were aware of it, maybe people would be more aware. I don't know, there'd be more of a possibility of like responding to it. But the way, chiefly the United States and other countries through like whatever TPP NAFTA has set up the game, neoliberal economic practices, these people who are, the things are set up such that like there's this invisible class of people you don't see around. Mm-hmm. So you get people living in different pockets. And so, there's various manifestations of these today, I think, in the way we have set up our society. And what makes it, like what an apocalyptic moment looks like for that would be a sort of exactly in the same sort of way, like unveiling, finding what, like, T.S. Eliot, finding ways to face and finding a people who are able to bear reality. And if that includes condemnation of your people, your parents, yourself, your own practices, your past, I would just want a Christian community that is willing and able, or at least willing to attempt to do that sort of work, even if that means the death of the previous way I've thought about the world or organized the world psychologically and physically.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one that comes to mind. I think you're right with public schools is another. The public school system, I mean, our kids we go to the local school here right in our neighborhood, and it's a perfect example of the kind of thing that happens in the United States for the last 40 years, which is that there's a sort of privatization effort or sort of lack of funds effort over time. They continue to be to have struggles based on that, and then people point to those struggles as more reason why they don't deserve funds, and this sort of like reverse feedback loop occurs. And that, again, predominantly affects people in the United States who are the same groups of people who were affected by policies of previous eras. So it'd be quite possible to say, I don't like the Confederate monument in Raleigh, but then say, yeah, but I don't want my kid going to some such school because if I did that, then blah, 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 blah. So there's myriad examples, but those are two that come to mind.
No, I think there
are too many options to name.
Yeah, in this image is I've been playing with where back in the day where they would attach leeches to sick people,
humans, baby,
and basically like suck their blood out to help them get better.
Like we basically killed George Washington this way. We drained like 8 pints of blood from him or whatever.
And so, and I don't remember, it was some article that was in some post-colonial philosophy of religion book that I was reviewing. So I have very little memory about who wrote this. So whoever it is, thank you for the story, because it stuck more in the rest of the article. But they gave this image on this problem. It said, like in a Civil War battlefield, you had all this gangrene, right? Like from people that got shrapnel and stuff. And it was actually killing more people after the battle from the wounds than during it. More. And they're putting leeches on people. And this nurse that was like new at helping and stuff got stuck into this, comes in and give these like engorged leeches, right? Stuck on these people that are more than less going to die. And the doctor doesn't know this person's new. Said, well, like all those leeches are engorged. You got to take them out of here. And she says, well, you mean take them out and you somebody like could throw them out there and kill them? He goes, no, we don't have any more leeches. You need to bleed them out so we can stick them back on. And like the whole system is built where there's all this violence and everything going on. And we do have a remedy. It's called a leech. And they're going to get so engorged. And when you don't want to like bleed them out, like get all the blood out in front of everybody. You got to take them somewhere else, hold the mouth open, and it describes this whole like procedure of basically making the leech like release all the blood so it can then immediately go start sucking again. And I just thought, like, that is the genius of our current system. Is if you have a problem, like you actually ask for a leech. What's that? Like a new credit card or whatever. Like there's so many different ways, right? Like what you think is a solution puts you back into the system of oppression itself. And then people think they're doing you a favor by taking the violence around the curtain and releasing it. So you just buy your iPhone. You just buy your jeans. You just go to the school and volunteer and donate there. Like there's so many ways in which just doing what you do means that there's a system where someone thought the reasonable solution is to suck blood out of injured people and then get the entity that sucked it out to vomit it out so they can stick it back on some other person.
I mean, it's always just that's the way things are.
Isn't
That's the way
that a
things- we've done
disgustingly
things.
accurate
Yeah.
image?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, yeah, it's the kind of thing. I guess one way to think about it would be, what are the sorts of things that in another 100 years, I mean, God willing, frankly, if we're even around, I think the Anthropocene time is coming to an end quickly. But anyway, are they going to look back and think in the same?
Are you sure? I don't think you've seen all of Steven Pinker's charts.
They go this way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he said, that was a problem for his optimism. Yeah, that's a really vivid and good image for it. And it does remind me, like, the sort of, when I talk about in the book, I mean, I do need apocalyptic monuments. I mean, that is sort of a sense of, like, when you read Revelation or apocalyptic literature, and that's sort of what they attempt to do, is sort of use these sorts of images to sort of bring to the fore something that people, if you're a fish in the water, it's harder to see, and you need a trip out west and to come back, or attentive to other sorts of communities within the communities that to my own shame I wasn't attentive to in high school or whatever. But someone seeing it from another angle that, like Sabrina is talking about, is able to look at and point to something that, if you're just the person getting the leech, you're not attentive to in the same kind of way. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not going to forget that image for long. You should look up who said that, whoever that was.
Well, I did assign it in the philosophy of religion class this semester. I just don't remember who wrote it, but
We'll find it.
Yeah. So everyone needs to go check out Cut in Stone. Ryan Newson. It's available, on places that you get books. And
Amazon
all the
Jungle.
cool kids are getting it. Maybe multiple copies, because it has a cool cover.
If it makes you mad, you should buy a few to burn.
Oh,
Buy some for your family and burn them together. That's my advice.
It simultaneously supports capitalist desire, and it demonstrates your superiority for having excess alienated labor to splurge on symbols of hatred. And I'm sure at least $1.13 or so of each of those purchases Ryan will see at some point.
I know Jeff Bezos earned that money. He get it to him.
I know. That's what I said last night. This is the question Elgin asked me before going to bed. Dad, you said if you have $1 billion, you must be immoral. Why would you say that? And I proceeded to explain it. And at halfway through my explanation, he goes, "Oh, no, that makes perfect sense. But I just thought, you said billion. Don't you think if you've already are keeping a couple million for yourself, you already have ethical issues?"
He's been reading John Chrysostom,
Yeah. Yeah.
Those radicals from the 1700 years ago.
Yeah, the radicals from the early church.
Yeah.
Luckily, if you are filthy rich, there are plenty of people who are ready to help you work out your salvation with fear and trembling.
You should all sign up for the one of the classes that you're taking and just throw a few million your way.
Yeah. I also have student loans. I'll just let you partake in it.
Yeah, seriously.
Well,
Trip, man, thanks for letting me. It was great. It's great. Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm just sad that Dino didn't join our podcast.
I know.
But if you ever wonder what kind of a dear affection I have for Ryan, that he has our dog. So, otherwise I would have asked even harder questions. I don't know what I would have done.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Good.
All right. Tell everyone hi. And I hope. Hold on. Let me stop.